Good afternoon from Lincoln, Nebraska. Thank you for joining us today as we unveil the NOAA-funded Drought THIRA website and toolkit. I'm Tanya Burnett, the Education and Outreach Specialist at the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I'm here with others from the University of Nebraska that partnered on the project, including staff from the National Drought Mitigation Center, Public Policy Center, and High Plains Regional Climate Center. As we've put in the chat box, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, or you can hold them until the end of the session. We're going to go around the room and introduce ourselves. Then Denise Bowling will start the webinar with an overview of the project. Crystal, since you're joining us remotely, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thanks, Tanya. Hello, everyone. This is Crystal Stiles with the High Plains Regional Climate Center.
My name is Lisa Pitlick-Zillig from the Public Policy Center.
This is Denise Bowling with University of Nebraska Public Policy Center.
This is Stacy Kochrow with the Public Policy Center.
Hi, I'm Tariq Abdulmanam from the Public Policy Center.
Hi, I'm Elliot Wickham with the National Drought Mitigation Center.
Deborah Bathke with the National Drought Mitigation Center.
And Nicole Wall with the National Drought Mitigation Center.
Hello, everybody. This is Denise Bowling, and I'll begin with a very brief overview. Many of you know that many states lack an integrated approach to link drought planning with water management plans, along with multi-hazard mitigation plans. And the goal of our project was to use climate data to develop, test, and disseminate a decision support model that applies the threat and hazard identification and risk assessment process to drought scenarios using climate data. This process is commonly referred to by its acronym, which is THIRA. The THIRA is a Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, mandated risk assessment process for all states. Essentially, this process helps communities answer the questions, what do we need to prepare for, and what shareable resources are required in order for us to be prepared. Now, drought is difficult for emergency management to model and to plan for, so it is seldom used as a threat in the THIRA process for state or local jurisdictions. Instead, most jurisdictions plan for drought separate from other hazards, and their plans reflect this disconnect. Since the THIRA process is mandated, it made sense to apply it to drought and to capture our lessons learned so it can be more readily used for drought or planning for water-related emergencies. Our project tested the THIRA process in the Platte River Basin, and today we're previewing for you the toolkit resulting from our experience that transfers understanding of how to implement this process using climate data. We believe this will help decision makers understand drought as a hazard in their jurisdictions and identify appropriate response capabilities. You'll also learn more about the process we use to involve the whole community in this effort. We're going to begin with a description of our outreach efforts. Nicole?
Thank you, Denise. Outreach efforts included active stakeholder engagement. Public participation theory and practice encourages actively engaging key stakeholders at various spectrum levels. These include the inform, involve, consult, collaborate, and empower levels. For our project, it was at the inform, involve, consult, and collaborative level in hopes that they would later be empowered to make better decisions in drought hazard planning within the FEMA structure. Our stakeholder advisory team involved professionals in the hazards or emergency management planning areas, and also the health, water, and educational sectors. This team evaluated our entire process, including the scenario and impact development information that was presented to our broader Platte River Basin stakeholders at the concluding workshop in Kearney, Nebraska, which will be discussed more later.
This is Denise again. Hopefully you can see the toolkit. Part one of the toolkit provides an overview and link to resources related to the THIRA process. The 3 steps of the process are detailed in an interactive mode with practical tips on how to implement the process. For example, by hovering over each step on page 6, you can quickly see the deliverables and more text explaining the process. Throughout the text, you can also hover over phrases or words to learn more about how they're defined in this context, and can click on links to documents where you can learn more. On page 8, part 1 also breaks down the implementation of the THIRA process into discrete steps and provides helpful hints on who to involve and how to involve them in the process. On page 11, we've also included things like sample agendas, videos, and tips to assist planners as they decide how to implement the process in their own area. On page 12 in part 1, it ends by moving readers towards understanding how planning for drought can be integrated in other plans through the use of the THIRA process. On page 14, we want the user to see the parallels between traditional drought planning and the use of the THIRA. This is explained in more detail in an embedded video with one of our emergency management partners. Now for part 2, I want to give you Crystal again. Crystal, will you unmute and take over?
Yes, thank you, Denise. The purpose of this section is to walk the planner through a logical process for developing a drought scenario to be used with the THIRA process. So we started with some background information on why and how drought scenarios are used to introduce the planner to the idea. And if you look at the figure 4, we outline some general steps that can be taken to create a drought scenario. Then we presented some options for what data to use, which might include historical records, climate and hydrologic models, or both. In the next section, we walk the planner through the process that we use to develop our drought scenario using the generalized steps from figure 4 that was just shown. We did not have funding to do modeling, so our scenario was completely constructed using historical data. We talked about why we chose the Platte River Basin of Nebraska for our planning region. And we then listed the primary participants in the scenario, which represented a wide variety of sectors. Next, we identified the background information we gathered for the scenario. All of the data we gathered were actual data from past droughts so that the scenario we were creating would be realistic. But if you look at figure 8, for example, this spreadsheet shows the planner the impacts we pulled from the Drought Impact Reporter and their corresponding U.S. Drought Monitor category. And then in figure 9, here we provide examples of ancillary information we use to create the scenario. As for creating challenges, we talked about how we consulted our stakeholder advisory group and how they decided on a multi-year drought that should present a worst case scenario. We then used all of the data we had gathered as a baseline and built the worst case drought scenario off of that. Then we began to develop the scenario components. So looking at figure 12, we wanted to show examples of the different types of data that we consulted to help us determine certain areas that might be more vulnerable to certain drought impacts. And then on figure 11, we wanted to show how we use the time series feature in the U.S. Drought Monitor to download and splice together periods of drought to create the severity and duration of the drought we wanted. So we created a video tutorial for that. So for the THIRA workshop, we provided an example of the one-page overview of the scenario and several PowerPoints and handouts we developed to give the workshop participants a big picture view of the scenario and help them generate discussion on the scenario. And we also provided a sample drought scenario to get them started. So in the next section, we stress the importance of adapting the scenario to their respective jurisdictions. We wanted to provide them with examples of how we did our scenario, but they should make the necessary changes to ensure they're considering their greatest drought issues in their jurisdictions. So for our scenario, we decided to discuss impacts at 3 different time points because drought is managed differently throughout its duration. But this is how we display drought severity with the impacts. We showed the percentage of area in drought on the U.S. Drought Monitor, and each letter on the graph represents an impact that occurred within the time frame shown. And below the graph, we color-coded and described the impacts occurring. The workshop participants seemed to really like these because they tell the story of the drought. So we did this for each time point of the drought that we wanted to focus on. Water year 1, when the drought began to develop. Water year 4, when the region had been in drought for several years and the drought had increased in spatial extent and severity. And water year 5, when the drought had reached peak intensity and spatial extent and began to slowly subside. We ended this section with a drought and climate resources page so that the planner can learn more about the data and tools available to them to create the scenario. And now I will hand it over to Tarek.
Hi, this is Tarek Abdulmanam. I'm going to be talking about part 3 of the toolkit. This section describes the third step of the THIRA process, which is to establish capability targets. Capability targets are essentially statements expressing what participants in a THIRA process want to happen for each core capability area. According to the National Preparedness Goal, there are 32 core capability areas that address the greatest risks to the nation. Capability statements basically express what participants in a THIRA process have identified as capabilities they would like to have in place, ideally, to address a potential threat or hazard scenario. So the example provided for one of the 32 core capability areas in our toolkit is the public information and warning core capability. So for that capability area, in a threat or hazard scenario, THIRA process participants would consider the public information and warning implications and needs associated with the threat or hazard on the community, discuss what sort of ideal outcome they would want to have in place in that area, and then develop a suitable capability statement. Not all 32 core capabilities may be included in a THIRA process. For example, for our multi-year drought scenario, we actually focused on about 19 of the 32 core capability areas that we felt were most applicable to our drought scenario. There's actually a list of the core capability areas we used in our drought scenario on our project webpage. And in our THIRA workshop exercise, our participants developed capability statements for the drought scenario we used for those core capability areas. So that's a brief description of part 3 of our toolkit. And now I'm going to hand it off to Lisa Pitlick-Zillig.
Thanks, Tarek. This is Lisa from the Public Policy Center. This last part of the toolkit offers a general framework for evaluating a THIRA process, and it includes an overview of what evaluation is, what it's intended to achieve, namely that evaluation aims to understand how a program or process like the THIRA process works and whether it achieved pre-identified goals and why or why not it did or did not do so. So then, to overview, the toolkit outlines 4 steps, beginning with identifying and evaluating the hoped for outcomes of the process, then identifying and evaluating stakeholder involvement in the process and in the evaluation, preparation and evaluation of the information that was provided during the THIRA process, and the design and evaluation of the process itself. For each of these 4 categories, the toolkit provides guidance and examples. So, for example, relating to the identification of the objectives and outcomes in Part A, the toolkit describes outcomes that may be commonly sought by THIRA processes, such as policy formation, education and awareness, and collaboration and relationship building outcomes. For each of these potential outcomes, examples of evaluation questions are given, and a link is given to the actual questions that we used in our evaluation processes. On the next pages, relating to stakeholder involvement, the toolkit suggests the types of stakeholders that may be appropriate to involve in THIRA processes and suggests identifying both who should be involved and how they should be involved, as well as suggesting questions that may be asked to evaluate whether a THIRA process achieved the goals for stakeholder involvement that were set. Then, relating to the preparation and assessment of the information provided during the THIRA engagement, the toolkit outlines some of the dimensions of information quality that THIRA program designers may want to assess. This includes the extent to which the information is complete and thus relevant to all the sectors that might be impacted by drought, the extent to which it's accessible and understandable to the stakeholders that are involved in the THIRA discussions, and as well as trustworthy, credible, and useful in the sense of being accurate, balanced, and relevant. And then fourth, relating to the processes used during THIRA engagements, the toolkit suggests use of both quantitative and qualitative measures to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the processes used during the THIRA engagement and the extent to which participants felt they had voice in the process. Then finally, for each of the 4 targets of evaluation, the toolkit recommends taking time for reflection to determine how the results could be applied for improving future THIRA processes. For example, the extent to which more, less, or different information might be useful to those involved in the process, and the extent to which various processes appear to achieve their outcomes, and whether and how the processes might be improved. So next, I'll turn it over to Stacy, who will give an overview of the different products that came from this process.
The Drought THIRA project has 3 main components: the Drought THIRA website, an interactive Drought THIRA toolkit, and a printable PDF version of the toolkit. The website provides access to all of the Drought THIRA components and resources. Here on the homepage, it provides a brief overview of the project, along with listing the primary organizations responsible for this toolkit. Each of these logos is clickable and links to that organization's individual website. On the About Us page, you have basic contact information for the individuals involved in the development of the Drought THIRA toolkit. The Drought THIRA toolkit page provides a portal for accessing the interactive Drought THIRA toolkit, which includes embedded videos, animations, and hyperlinks to connect to supporting resources throughout the toolkit. Within the interactive digital toolkit, you'll actually find a clickable list of resources that follows the order in which they appear in the toolkit. An acknowledgement page lists individuals who played a vital role in contributing to the development of the toolkit as well. And the final pages contain an interactive glossary that allows you to see the definitions and resources for key terms within the document, while also allowing you to jump to a page and see that term in context. The printable PDF is available on the website just by clicking this button. And this version of the toolkit has an alternate layout and design that's more printer friendly, but still contains hyperlinks to all the available resources within the toolkit. And finally, the resources page has a list of all the resources that are provided with links to handouts, videos, and website resources essential for using the Drought THIRA toolkit. At this point, I'm going to hand things over to Tanya for some closing comments.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm back. We're going to start by answering the questions in the chat box. And then after that's done, we'll open up for any other questions. So you can just unmute and ask a question after that. I'm going to turn it over to Jules to go through the chat box questions. Oh, there aren't any, it doesn't look like. Okay, well, does anybody have any questions? If you want to, you can put it in the chat box or you can unmute and ask. Be happy to take any questions. I guess one question that I have for everybody, if nobody has a question, is how would this be useful for you dissemination wise? How, where would you like to disseminate this? Does anybody have any suggestions for that?
This is Don Wilson. I have a question.
Oh, somebody just asked a question. Who is this?
This is Don Nelson in Lincoln.
Hi, Don.
Congress and the states over the course of more than 100 years have chosen to establish interstate surface water compacts. And these compacts generally have set forth in law amounts of water or quality of water that must be delivered at specific sites, usually without regard to meteorological events. How would THIRA be used by any one of these compacts to come up with a strategy to deal with drought up against the congressionally mandated targets?
Hi, Don. It's Nicole Wall, and I worked for a couple years with the Republican River Task Force as a co-facilitator. And that was a initiative started by, at the time, Senator Tom Carlson, if you remember him. And one of the things I remember about that process is that through that task force is that that we didn't discuss FEMA or much of hazard planning, but I thought that structure that Senator Tom Carlson set up allowed lots of thinking and collaborative insight to perhaps address these kinds of issues. So while I can't answer your question specifically, I think that if we have legislatures, especially here in Nebraska, that are a little bit forward thinking, and we have stakeholders on the ground, which I know with the NRDs, they're so proactive, and we have consultants in the state that are willing to work with these proactive stakeholders as well. I think that this is a great opportunity for our entire state to come together to perhaps integrate this type of hazard planning within a FEMA structure within these types of activities. So I'm not addressing your question. I know I'm not like answering it fully, but I think we have an opportunity here to do future work.
And what would be the proper point of entry to launch that work?
Don, this is Denise Bulling, and I'm going to answer that quickly and then also address two chat questions. The chat questions were, how was FEMA involved in the project and what were the strengths and weaknesses of the process for drought? The point of entry, Don, for this is usually through emergency management for the THIRA processes. They are tasked with doing a lot of the planning in each state. And I think that's a good point of entry. FEMA was not involved directly in this process that we ran, but we used the FEMA products and processes. So, for example, the guidance that this toolkit links with are all FEMA products. So this is a process that all states are familiar with. The process is evolving continually and getting better, but there is quite a bit of guidance out there for that process. The strengths and weaknesses of the THIRA process for drought, I think there's still some discussion about how useful it is, any planning process when you're modeling worst case scenarios. However, I think the strength is that it is a way to bring drought to as a hazard to people who are not traditionally involved in emergency management planning, and to the community. It's also a strength by using a standard process that is done by all states and applying it to the water management field, because they're not necessarily using a standard process across all jurisdictions. So the weakness is that it is a formal process. It is time intensive. That it does depend somewhat on the people who show up for your processes. It may take repeated processes in order to involve all members of the community. I hope that was helpful. Other strengths and weaknesses from around the table? Thoughts? Okay.
So in the case of Nebraska, the point of entry would be NEMA?
NEMA is the point of entry for the FEMA THIRA processes. And locally, they are using the processes as well in the planning exercise training regions. So for more information about that, you can certainly click on the links on the website or visit the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency website to get an idea of what their planning processes are about. And I believe they may be on this webinar. And if you want to speak up and address that, if I'm wrong, please do so, Nima. Are there any other questions or comments?
Okay, well, with that, if we don't have any further questions, we can conclude, and we will be sending out a recording of this too. So if you have colleagues or supervisors that weren't able to get on, yeah, we'll post it on the website. So if you want to check it out on there, you sure can. Thank you very much.